Alright, welcome back to Fast Gadgets. Today I want to talk about Fedora 23, Fedora Support, and end of life. So I get asked this question quite often. As a Fedora user, are there any long-term support packages for Fedora? To put it mildly, the answer is no. So if you are interested in long-term support, what are your alternatives? Well, you have a couple of possibilities. One is you can get the latest Red Hat. Usually you're going to do it using something like CentOS, which compiles the Red Hat source code and makes the images for you, so you have a package that you can download and then use the ISO, of course. So with with CentOS, that is essentially the long-term support. What's the major downside of CentOS or Red Hat? Red Hat's goal is to be extremely stable. Okay, so what that means is you won't necessarily see all the features that are in Fedora in the latest release of Red Hat. The reason being, Fedora is really the experimental arm of the whole Red Hat enterprise. Now, of course, Fedora is completely open source and partially funded by Red Hat the company, and there's many contributors to Fedora overall, but the whole purpose is almost like an incubator for ideas, concepts, software changes, updates that would fit well for Red Hat. So although Fedora has all the features of modern operating system, it is somewhat of an incubator. So with Fedora, you get on one side of the sword, on one edge, a very up-to-date operating system that is very fresh but not raw. Okay, so it's leading edge without necessarily being bleeding edge. It's very stable. The downside is it doesn't have very long support, and if you look around for Fedora support, you'll see that we're on Fedora 24 now. It's just been released maybe a month ago, and Fedora 22 support actually ended right after the release of Fedora 24. So what can you expect? Well, it was maintained for a little over a year. So whatever version of Fedora you happen to be on is only going to have mainstream support, meaning significant updates, architectural changes, and so on. Now, I have noticed, I've used some older versions of Fedora, that you can still get kernel updates and some security updates depending on the package, even though Fedora itself no longer maintains the repositories. I have noticed that you can get some updates. So if I took out a Fedora 22 image and rolled it out, there would be some updates available. So their basic principle is each version of Fedora is maintained for release X number plus 2. So you say go on to Fedora 24 right now, your Fedora will be maintained until a few days after Fedora 26 is released. Well, it says 1 month after the release of X plus 2, but it somewhere around in there they drop support, mainstream support. So what you can look forward to is about a year of support. Luckily for us, Fedora changes are evolutionary, not revolutionary. So what that means is if you have to go to the next version of Fedora, it's really not that big of a deal, provided you don't have any critical applications that you need for production purposes. I've talked about that before. If you have a business or a home use or whatever where you need your system to be up almost 100% of the time, it's always best to have two systems. In the case of this system here, this is my i3, and I'm still running Fedora 23 here. So I'll just put in my password real quick if I can remember it. And if I do a uname, so my kernel version is 4.6.4-201 Fedora Core 23, the 64-bit version. So I do like to keep one system on the previous version of Fedora. This particular Lenovo I'm using, it's an i3 with 4 gig of RAM. It's a dual boot, so it has Windows 10 and it has Fedora 23. And when I'm ready to update, I will do a DNF update, and I won't even bother downloading the ISO. I'll just do the update like I did on my other system. So are there still updates right now for Fedora? You betcha. There's a ton of them. Actually, I'm not going to do -y. I'll just do update, and we'll have a look and see how many updates are available out there. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what you shouldn't expect to get. So there is a downside. Okay, so we've got 295 megabytes, and I have done several updates of this system since Fedora 24 has come out. So the updates are still alive and well, still coming out. Kernel is coming out on a regular basis, and there's some other packages that are being updated. Python, the Plasma desktop interface, because I actually have several desktop environments on this system. Some core packages, ksysguard, so those are some more Plasma KDE packages. HTTP is being updated, Apache, and Firefox, Fuse, some GNOME updates. The Breeze cursor theme is being updated, and VirtualBox is going to be updated for me, which I really like. So I get the updates with VirtualBox. I reboot. I do not have to worry about recompiling VMware drivers, and every time you get a new kernel it breaks. If you use VMware, just so you know, on Linux, I usually freeze my kernel and very, very, very carefully consider updating the kernel when I'm on VMware. But anyway, what don't you get? What I have seen, and I'm not sure why, but once the new version of Fedora is out, like Fedora 24, you still get what appears to be security updates or bug fixes. What you will not see is any major versions. So, for example, if LibreOffice were updated to a new major version, you would not get that version in Fedora 23. Kdenlive, my editor that I use all the time, if there's a new version of Kdenlive, which there is, I will get that in Fedora 24, and I did, but I will not get it in Fedora 23. And the more I think about it, it just makes sense to me, because again, we're looking at a not-for-profit open source operating system that has limited resources available, so the lion's share of development and management and maintaining the packages is going to go to Fedora 24. Is it better or worse of a system than, say, Ubuntu that has frequent updates, and then they have an LTS, which is long-term support? It's a toss-up. It all depends what you want to do. Ubuntu for me is perfectly fine. If you need something that's completely stable, like a long-term support release, and that's what you need, well, think about the long-term support releases. When they're released, they can go for, I don't even remember anymore, but I think as long as 5 years. If you need a long-term support release of Fedora, you should be using CentOS, which is the free open source compile of Red Hat. Of course, you could get Red Hat if you wanted to, whatever. So there are options of long-term support, if you will, with Fedora. So that's basically my take on it. I stick around on Fedora, and it works well for me. I really like it, and I know how to manage and work with the infrastructure, so I tend to stay with it, for the most part. And you may agree or disagree, and this is just my opinion, but I feel that Red Hat and Red Hat derivatives are probably the core of servers out there that are used, that are Linux based. Certainly there's other ones out there that are great. I had a friend of mine, he and I were running a web service, and he decided to put it up on FreeBSD, and I learned a lot about FreeBSD, which is not even Linux, and I have a lot of respect for that operating system as well. So I'm not saying one is better than the other, it's just a matter of opinion for me. But I will say one mistake I made early on in my IT administrative duties. I don't know why I did this, considering that we had, well, actually, now that I think about it, back in the day, I don't think there was a CentOS, and we had limited Red Hat licenses, so we would turn out servers that were running on Fedora, and we, of course, embraced virtualization. We got a vSphere system put in, and for example, we would create a wiki server, and I would put it on Fedora. Then we would create a survey server, and I would put it on Fedora. And I realized pretty quickly that I was shooting myself in the foot, and we were running a server farm that had about 80 servers, and my realization was, wow, maintenance on these is really painful, because we now have to do OS updates at least annually to continue to get service and to get maintenance for that particular operating system. So I learned fairly quickly, since I was working for a huge nonprofit, I can get the Red Hat support. It was something ridiculous, like $25 a year for one system. It was an awesome deal. And I realized, okay, I'm really doing this the wrong way, and we migrated most of the systems we needed to Red Hat. If we weren't on Red Hat by that time, CentOS was available, and we started using CentOS if we didn't want to expend a Red Hat license. But usually we weren't worried about it, because the cost was pretty low. So that's my whole take on Fedora release cycle, getting long-term support, and why I use Fedora as far as using it as a, well, of course I don't use it as a server anymore. I would opt for CentOS or Red Hat. There's other products out there. Debian would be good, that could be used as a server as well. And I know I released a video on Arch Linux. I have my second one coming out where I put on the graphical interface, and you get to watch me bumble through that one too, because as I mentioned in my comments, I tend to rush through things, and I see things in broad strokes, like I can do this really quick, and then I miss some tiny piece of information, and I have to go back and do it again because I did it wrong the first time. But I learned a lot from it, so it's not all bad. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you again for those of you who have subscribed. I hope you're enjoying the videos and you're learning something, and I look forward to seeing you on the next video.